Welcome to the Darnell and Cody Show, where we talk about social, political, and philosophical issues currently relevant to us as a society. Today we're going to be talking about Black Lives Matter and the protests. A lot has happened with Black Lives Matter and how the movement has grown over the course of or almost 2 months now, actually. So we're just going to go ahead and get right into that. For me, the protests seem to have started, obviously, with the incident of George Floyd's murder and people being completely fed up with police malpractice in general, but we can't ignore that the water was already at a boiling point from COVID and economic inequality that has only been expanded by the pandemic, in which people that were white collar were uh, able to stay home and work from their computers, and people that are blue collar ended up having to make a decision of either putting their own health at risk or losing their job and having to either go on unemployment or um, go to work and face potential health risks. So governments besides America, such as Canada and most of Europe, are giving people stimulus checks monthly instead of the one-time thing that America got. And many of these countries are also paying the companies through a payroll program in order to essentially just keep people that aren't actually working on the payroll of the company. And the companies that are getting these loans don't have to actually pay them back as long as they're paying people directly through the payroll program. So this seems like a much better way to do it, and it wouldn't have caused as much class divide as we're experiencing right now, which, as I said, was kind of a boiling point to get everyone as pissed off as they are, just not by police malpractice, but the fact that they had to kind of stay home and had cabin fever and worrying about their financial status as well during all of this. So what are your thoughts there, Darnell?
Yeah, I completely agree. The United States response to the whole COVID situation, as we previously talked about in our previous podcast, has basically been so lacking, especially in comparison to other countries, that it's basically probably marginally better than a third world country. But can we really say that honestly? We have some of the most exorbitantly expensive healthcare system in the world at a marginal level of care as well. It's not like we're that much better in care than other countries even. And right now we're stuck in a situation where we're getting something like 10,000 cases daily. You know, like in Florida, this is just in one state. There was 10,000 cases recently in Florida. And you compare that with a place like Korea, which was one of the first countries that the COVID, really spread in terms of nations. They have a total case of 15,000. So we have, as a nation, just absolutely failed. And it's hard to just blame the government, but yes, the government is horrifically at fault here. Don't get me wrong on that account, but we really have this, I want to say, individualistic mindset where, it's okay to have a state of individualism when it's what you wear to express yourself. I think it's cool that we can wear whatever we want and we can say whatever we want, not have to care about other people's opinion of us. But when we are in a pandemic, I feel like people should have a little bit of a collective, mindset about just public health, health concerns. So when people, like for example, refusing to wear masks and stuff like that, it's really inexcusable. When the data clearly says, the mask is all important in preventing spread, as evidenced by, Korea, Japan, and Europe. So on all fronts, we have failed. And this is really just an embarrassment at this point, a national embarrassment.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And obviously, with the protests going on now, people tend to be wearing masks at least during this protest, but getting people crowded together in these streets to have these activist movements, it's just really bad timing, unfortunately. People are obviously putting themselves at risk for the movement, but that's kind of going uncovered by some of the outlets where they would obviously be talking about this if it was right-wing protests more. So it's just kind of interesting the bias as well that we're seeing from the media. But moving on to the protests themselves now, when they first broke out, there was Trump's response to everything, which was probably one of the worst possible for a sitting president to do. He could have won over a lot of voters by saying the right things, like promising police reform, getting federal oversight, like impartial prosecutors for police. Instead, he used police and the National Guard to clear out peaceful protesters using tear gas and rubber bullets, so that he could have his photo shoot in front of a Baptist church in Washington, D.C. And he doesn't even go to this church, obviously. He's just there to get that photo shoot. And he used violence to clear out protesters. He tweeted out about a 75-year-old man being pushed by cops that we all saw, that he fell harder than he actually was pushed, as if like the man staged his falling or something like that. So Trump, he's not really understanding what to do here. He has made some moves for police reform, and most recent, I think it was about a week ago now. So, I mean, he is starting to realize this is not just, this isn't just liberals. This is kind of like a populist thing that a lot of people agree with. So he's starting to get on board, but he's not going far enough, and he already has done a lot of political damage to himself here. But I don't know if you have anything to touch on the president before we just actually get into what Black Lives Matter itself really means for some people, and how there's, there's a lot of haze over that, what actually it means for, I mean, even the movement itself isn't organized. So I don't know if you want to get into that, Darnell.
All right, before we move on to that, I'd say just last thing on the president. He really, really dropped the ball on this. He could not have dropped the ball harder on this. He could not have messed things up harder. I mean, at the beginning, I think he had the right idea. He was like, all right, we're going to ban travel from China and Europe. But when the virus started getting serious, he was sending very, very mixed signals about the coronavirus, saying, oh, it's not that dangerous. It's not spreading that much. It's under control. Like a million vaccines are on the way, or like a million testing is on the way. And it is all just empty nonsense that he was just, sprouting to the public. I mean, at one point we had the public literally drinking bleach. I mean, how bad? What a nightmare, Like, I don't even know what to say about the things that have been going on in this nation these past months. But yeah, like, I think the biggest thing is, even now, I mean, he recently just started wearing masks in public. So he had his first photo taken with him wearing a mask. And it's insane. He's saying basically it's emasculating to wear a mask. I mean, how insecure do you have to be as a man to even suggest such a thing in the middle of a pandemic where people are looking up to you for guidance, and you're scared of looking emasculate? I mean, how weak-willed and how weak is your self-image that you have to rely on that? And I just think, as awful as Joe Biden seems to be at times, he's definitely a much better alternative than Trump.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, as I was saying, he even was insecure about these protests going on to the point where he had to call National Guard and police and using tear gas or rubber bullets and stuff like that just for a photo shoot. So, I mean, the guy has this personality where he's just like an egotistical narcissist, but he thinks his ego is like that fragile. I don't know. It's very strange. But anyway, you want to take us into Black Lives Matter itself now?
Right, Black Lives Matter. And Black Lives Matter is, admittedly, it's at the heart of the protest at this point. And Black Lives Matter basically is an amorphous, spontaneous movement with no real founders or leaders. It started as a hashtag on Twitter. For that reason, I'm not exactly sure what it means to be fully part of that movement. Is it to kneel during national anthems? to go to the protests? Is it to start autonomous zones or free of police? There's no real central message other than combating police brutality, assumedly. What concerns me is that this movement also potentially comes with some baggage, like part of woke culture, cancel culture, virtue signaling, so common from the leftist groups, where they say that if you're not part of our group, you don't care about black people or racism or police brutality, as if people weren't against racism and police brutality before this hashtag #BeFame movement. But more to the point, when I look at the gross misconduct of the police, I don't focus on just the ones where the victim is black. So Daniel Shaver comes to mind as the most prominent example, or the more recent example of a white woman being shot by an Asian officer for not having her dog on a leash. We don't scream racism in these situations because it's most likely untrue, and we're not in the heads of the officers to know what their intent was. It may be that the Asian officer is sexist and racist against a white woman, but it strikes us as a disingenuous and convoluted presumption. But when it's a black victim of police brutality, there is no room for debate. It's automatically assumed to be racism. And I understand there's a historical context to that. Racism is deeply embedded in American history and lives on in the undercurrents of our culture even today. But when we overcome our indignation of that dark history that still lives on, we have to also take a step back and truly consider if there is a racial prejudice instead of almost instinctively presuming it.
Yeah, I 100% would agree with you about the woke culture stuff kind of bleeding into this Black Lives Matter movement, which obviously happens with pretty much everything liberal at this point. And it's also incredibly dangerous, as you said, to just uncharacteristically paint everybody as a racist that's working for the police force, or even just looking at all these instances of police brutality and police violence. Perhaps it's better to say that police overall are just poorly trained and don't have the proper skill sets than to just blanket assume that everyone is racist. I believe you mentioned the Daniel Shriver case. And if anyone doesn't know, it was one of the most horrific cases I've seen, which was actually videotaped. You can watch the guy die. And he's in the middle of a hallway begging for his life for like 3 minutes. And they are giving him conflicting commands, demanding that he do this and that. That's conflicting with the other demand they gave him. And he's crawling down towards them according to their demands. And they end up shooting him because his pants are falling down. And he reaches behind his back to, pull his pants up, and he gets shot in that exact instant. So, as you said, it's not just police brutality on black people; it's police brutality overall. But where the movement, I think, its name is that disproportionately black people seem to be faced with police brutality in and of itself. And that has to do with how their communities are policed, I think, which is what a lot of this movement is about as well. People want community policing instead of just, looking for the criminal. And that goes way back to the war on drugs, which we can get into, which kind of changed the way police actually interacted with the public itself. So obviously, it's kind of like the protests themselves. There are bad actors that are using violence just as an opportunity, and we don't immediately assume that all the protesters are, violent protesting and trying to just take advantage of this. The same should be said about the police. Not all of them are just bystanders to allow violence or participants in violence. So yeah, we have to be very careful about what we say.
Right, and just to dig into those statistics that you mentioned, basically the statistics you mentioned are from all multiple sources, prominent sources that say that black people are twice or even up to 4 times more likely to be killed by cops than white people. But to assume that the police as an institution is racist because of this is reductive, like you were saying. Scientists across the board agree that there's simply not enough data to determine if there is a racial basis. And to quote Brenton Mock from City Lab, To determine whether racist motivations are fueling police shootings, you need to know the race of the people killed by police in a given department, and also race of all the people who the police shot but didn't kill. Perhaps the most difficult data point is that you would need to gather all the races of all the people police came into contact with but did nothing to at all. This cumulative data is called the police encounter rate, and the scientists who have been studying police violence say that this is the most critical yet most elusive data needed to register racial bias. So they go into a thought experiment where they explain how this is true. Just to sum it up, basically, without this police encounter rate, we have no way of scientifically knowing if there is racial prejudice. But let's bring up another statistic here, since we were talking about statistics. According to the NCBI report, where it says that black people are 2.8 times more likely to face lethal force by cops, we have to also look at Hispanics, who are 1.1 times more likely to face lethal force by cops, and also at Asians, who are 0.05 times more likely to face lethal force by cops, which is to say Asians, more than any other race, including whites, face the least amount of lethal force by cops by a significant margin. It's not even a contest. So when we say that black lives are treated less valuable based on this statistic, then by the same token, we're reasoning that we're deducing that Asians' lives are treated as far more valuable than any other race by the cops, than all the other races, which again would be a ridiculous thing to say if you take the time to think about it. And we can also say that cops are sexist, since men are significantly more likely to be shot by police than a woman is, based on these statistics. Again, this would be a terribly dubious argument to make. Not going into all the nuances beyond the variables is a huge mistake, because the nuances are what really matters, and the context is everything. So it's easy to misuse statistics without delving into them. For example, black people being 13% of the population commit more than half the murders in the United States. Does this mean that black people are more likely to be murderers in the virtue of being black? Of course not. If we look at the context behind the statistics, we see that black people are much more likely to live in impoverished conditions with poor education, high gang and criminal activity, broken homes, among other factors that contribute to that statistic. So we have to be very careful when we quote statistics at face value and avoid making these reductivist assumptions. And while finally on the topic of statistics, let's mention just a few more. 3 people are killed daily by the police, which sounds especially horrendous given the current climate. Our first reaction is to assume that the cops were in the wrong. But let's look at these statistics here. 87%, according to the NCBI report, of police use of lethal force, there was an evidence of immediate threat, perceived or actual, posed by the victim towards law enforcement or civilians. Now, that's still troubling. 13% of victims weren't posing any threats but still killed. But this is the critical point here, do we attribute that 13% to racism or police incompetence? Because that 13% isn't just black people. We have to remind ourselves. I'm inclined to think that it's much more of the latter than the former. The reality is that when there is a police shooting due to negligence, incompetence, or even actual racism, we magnify that to such an extent that all police shootings become unjustified, and all deaths of minority victims become an issue of racism. And I think that this tracks from the real issue, which is grossly incompetent policing standards.
Yeah, I agree with you there. You have to be very careful which statistics you're using, how you're trying to cite those statistics. You mentioned quite a few there, so the one that really struck me the most was the 3 deaths a day. And the reason that struck me is because I don't think that just because someone is posing a threat, they should be killed unless they're actually about to kill somebody else. So a good example of this is the way the UK handles people that are posing a quote-unquote threat. Again, these people are not armed with firearms the way that they potentially are in America. So you have to, in my opinion, look at those deaths very specifically, case by case, to determine whether they're wrongful or not. There's a lot of people that are mentally ill in America that may be deemed to pose a threat, when in actuality, using tactics that other police forces use around the world, you'd be able to defuse the situation without anybody dying. One of the instances that comes to mind in UK, a man was running around the streets with a hatchet, threatening to cut everybody up, and the police in the UK, instead of shooting him, got riot shields and surrounded him in a circle and were able to tackle him down on the ground after completely surrounding the man, and he wasn't able to do anything with the hatchet against riot shields. So in America, the guy would have been killed. In the UK, the guy gets to go to a hospital and find out what's wrong with him. And that's what people are talking about when we see these 3 deaths a day. Just because someone's posing a threat doesn't mean they deserve to be killed. And a lot of people posing threats are mentally ill or have something wrong with them mentally at that time. So I just don't like the fact that anybody is getting killed by the police. Maybe if that number dropped down to like 200, and you could say, okay, like these people are the ones that are actually pulling guns on us or something like that. But we don't even know which deaths are those deaths. We're just getting the number posing threat, which is very vague and doesn't actually mean anything to me. But moving past that, um, you obviously mentioned a lot of things about how wrongful deaths aren't just happening to black people, and you mentioned a very good statistic about, we obviously don't consider Asians more valuable just because they are getting killed less than everybody else. But at the same time, we have to be very careful when looking at just how people are actually charged in the criminal process, especially the criminal justice system, which, as we both know, is quite broken. So just looking at people that are arrested in federal and state prisons, nearly 80 people in federal prison and 60% of people in state prisons are drug offenses that are black or Latino offenders. And research has shown that prosecutors pursue a mandatory minimum sentence much higher for black and Latinos than they do for white people. The statistics on that in 2001 were that by average, sentencing for Latinos were 38% higher than they were for their white counterparts for the same charges, and 31% for black people. Native Americans are also disproportionately affected by this. So it's not just about wrongful deaths and stuff like that. It's just the actual process in which people go through as well, that we're seeing a lot of disparity and disproportionality in terms of which group is being affected more. So I think that's where the name Black Lives Matter comes from. Like, obviously, that name has been around much longer than these protests that have sparked since George Floyd's death. But people just continue to point to the fact that disproportionately black people seem to be affected. And I think it's, unfortunately, the name Black Lives Matter is causing some divisiveness, and it's unfortunately leaving some people out, or at least people feel as though they're being left out. So I think it would possibly be good to maybe put up another name, but the movement itself is not just about black people. It's about trying to solve the way that the police actually interact with people, trying to get community policing instead of just people looking at everybody as though they're a criminal. The same thing with the defund the police movement. The defund the police doesn't actually mean getting rid or defunding the entire police force. Most people support reforming and reconstructing the police. A lot of people, such as the Campaign Zero initiative, which a lot of people are starting to support, all of their basically requests or demands that the police do. So people are trying to end broken window policing, community oversight on policing. They're trying to get limited uses of force, independent investigations on cops who commit crimes, community representation in policing, body cams on policing at all times for all interactions, and they can't turn them off under penalty of law. We're doing training towards de-escalation and nonviolent endings. Something like I said earlier, we should be able to de-escalate things without people getting shot. Ending for-profit policing, demilitarizing the policing to catch up to other countries, and making sure policing has fair union contracts so that police actually can get paid what they deserve. And then, of course, ending the war on drugs, which is what really starts the way that police interact with people in such a negative way. So That's a lot of what people are demanding. I think a lot of people agree with those. I saw something where something like 76% of people agree with the zero or campaign zero initiatives now. So that's a good sign. We're obviously making progress as a nation. But I think it's because of the fact that we're not only focusing on Black people. Like all these things that I just listed affects everybody. It doesn't just affect one community. And that's how I think that we're going to make some change in the country and bring everybody to the table instead of having some people upset that they feel like they don't have really a voice. So what do you think about that, Darnell?
Right, you mentioned quite a few things there. I'll start in order. I think you mentioned the UK. I think that's the first thing you said. The UK situation, that's very interesting and that's admirable and something that we should try to attain. Because you're right, a lot of these victims of police shootings are some are just suicidal. A lot of them are just suicide by cop, or just they're just mentally unstable. And also, a shocking amount of them are just domestic violence cases where the husband is, threatening to, or I think aggressively to cops, and they're just, shot basically. So again, I don't think these are racist issues. It's obviously these are just, we have gross policing standards, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that, a significant portion of our population is armed with not just pistols, like, they're loaded. We could literally start wars with just what our population of citizens own. In ammunition and weapons. So I understand cops have a very stressful job. This is, again, why we have to really focus so hard on retraining them, having higher qualifications and standards for our police officers. But it's really unfair just to say, every time someone dies, it's racist. Or there are contexts to that. And you mentioned the drug issue, which I completely agree with. That is probably the single biggest thing affecting the Black community, or even just minorities at large, brown people too. So when you mention drug prosecutors, though, it's interesting because the movement doesn't really focus on that much. By and large, it's about just saying cops are bad. We don't need cops. Police brutality. They're shooting us. They don't think that our lives matter as much. That's literally what the movement initially started as. It was about, I think, either Rice or Brown. When one of those two people were killed, that's when the original Black Lives Matter movement started. And I completely agree. But I think it's also unfair to say that cops aren't drug prosecutors. You can't really link them. Directly, at least. I mean, in terms of arrests, I agree 200%. But in terms of like convictions, the judges and stuff like that, that goes beyond the cops. So we have a law problem where our congressmen and our congresswomen have to get things together. Our Senate has to get together. Our president has to get together and really end the war on drugs. And what's crazy to me is we have like these Black prosecutors, Black leaders, like Kamala Harris. She was, basically vehemently against drugs, and like she's a key role in prolonging the war on drugs, even strengthening it, as did Biden and Obama. Even like Obama, I think was hugely failed in this regard for the Black community. And this is one of the first things that he should have done, so just ending the war on drugs to help Black people. But again, saying that this is like a racial issue, saying like Black Lives Matter is like racism, like systemic racism or something like that, I just don't see it. I just think that's kind of like a disingenuous argument to make, even though I agree that there are some aspects of like societal racism that reflects in the policies that we have, or I should say how the policing is done. And to go on with misusing or focusing on just the crime aspect or law enforcement aspect of Black Lives Matter is also troubling to me, because we don't focus on the root causes of a lot of the struggles that the Black community has. So way more Black people kill Black people than a police officer will ever kill a Black person. There is significant, it's not even close. The leading youngest cause for a young Black teen is homicide by another Black person. So that's something that we should really be focusing on, because that's the horrible statistic. Like, forget about Black Lives Matter, forget about All Lives Matter. Just what can we do to help Black communities? That should be priority number one. How are we going to stop Black on Black crime? How are we going to fix single moms? Again, 70% of Black children are born in single parent homes. That's absolutely insane. That should never happen in a well functioning society. And of course, the dependence on the welfare system, which is a multi-layered problem that we have to really examine and see what's really going to work. Because there's complicated issues. I'm not saying I have the answers for that, but it's very clear that we have basically incentivized young women to basically marry the welfare system and collect these checks without really taking care of their children. So yeah, I mean, and then the defund the police. I completely agree with you there again. Poorly phrased, I would say, but definitely needed. Like, if it just means reform, I think everyone agrees that we definitely need to reform the police brutality, as I've been saying. We've been both saying, and I'll get more into that later. But if you have anything to respond to this, Cody.
Yeah, I mean, I basically am totally in agreement with you. First off, like, these hashtags, Black Lives Matter and defund the police, they're not really the best names for these things, I guess. It just is causing divisiveness because of the language that you're choosing to call your movement, in my opinion, which is not smart. You should have like a name for your movement that causes as little divisiveness as possible. And I absolutely agree with you on the Black Lives Matter, just needing good leadership. They're not really hitting the nail on the head with a lot of things that are actually affecting the Black communities more than just the policing itself, which does need to be addressed, and they are trying to address that, but they're not. As you said, I mean, there's lots of other things. Economic inequality that's disproportionately affecting Black communities in urban areas. I mean, the list goes on, obviously. So to miss those important issues while trying to tackle this one issue is a little illogical, to some people at least. I can see the logic behind trying to fix the police, but as you said, there are other issues to fix, and they really, really need to be addressed as well. And they're a little bit more complicated issues. Fixing the police, we kind of know what to do there. But what do we do about correcting like black on black violence? It's a much more complicated issue. It has to do with economics. It has to do with the community that they're living in. I mean, it's just so much stuff goes into that. And as you said, this movement's not hitting the mark on that in particular. So yeah, I agree with you there.
Right, and that's why I always get a little bit emotional, tear up a little when I think of Andrew Yang, because what was his motto? He was like, address the roots. Don't address the symptoms, address the roots. And if you look at even police brutality, there's a root to all these issues that we're having, and we're not tackling them. I think we're just reacting to the symptoms more than actually tackling these root causes. But moving on, I think a lot of people are also viewing police department as a monolith. And I think everyone should be careful when talking about police as a singular institution under all contexts. For example, locally they're different. Their culture and the way of policing is different. Their chiefs are different. Their opinions are different. In fact, different states and cities have drastically different police shooting statistics. For instance, if you're far more likely to be killed as a black person in Oklahoma as opposed to Georgia. So it's simply not true to say that all law enforcement is the same. They're all racist and stuff like this. Blanket statements that you see these groups saying. A prominent example of how police departments are different is like a place like Camden, New Jersey, where they completely uprooted their previous police department and reformed their police to suit their local needs remarkably well. They're a role model in many ways to how we should reform the police. They believe in engaging with the public, being a member of the community, knowing people by their names, having conversations with them, actually building relationships to put these police officers in the same boat as the racist cops out there is doing an injustice, in my opinion. And we have to acknowledge them as individuals too, and not just judge them by the badge they wear. Because we all agree that racism is bad because it dehumanizes people for only looking at the color of their skin. We have to also agree that demonizing cops just because of their badge is also unjust. So when people say that the police is a racist institution, I think they should take a step back to think about what they really mean by that and who they're including in that umbrella. Because we've come to a point where people are starting to look at the police as this big fascist authoritarian institution. If you want to see authoritarian police, you go to look at Hong Kong right now. That's authoritarian police, or China generally, or even Russia. The cops just enforce the laws our politicians make, and I think they do a poor job of it. Yes, but these hyperbolic rhetoric doesn't really offer solutions or even correctly depict the problem, because the problem is incompetency, corruption, and lack of accountability. The solution is reform, as we've discussed. And again, it's not racism that's the problem, or to quote Seth Stoughton, a former police officer who is now a law professor, we do not have a race problem in policing. Rather, we have a race problem in society that is reflected in policing. I wholeheartedly agree with that. When we look at cases like the black birdwatcher in New York Central Park, who some white lady tried to frame as trying to rape her, or the infamous Starbucks story where two black guys were just randomly asked to leave and had like the cops called on them, we have to have a real conversation about racism that exists in our community at large, and not just like accuse all cops of being racist. But back to the solution, I think Jocko Willings has a very comprehensive plan. Basically, we should have higher standards and qualifications for police officers. We should have mandatory and consistent training in things like jiu-jitsu, high tension management skills, decompression skills, de-escalation drills, and so forth. If we couple that with like Yang's plan for being able to call a cop that doesn't come strapped with a gun, and have a federal register of overseeing cops with bad track records, we would be able to solve the police brutality situation, period, for all races. And then we can really look at how we address the race problem in society, which is a separate issue, in my opinion, that's conflated with the police brutality issue that we have. And on that note, I would be advocating for solutions to fix the incredibly higher rates black people are living in impoverished communities with poor education systems, while living in subculture of single parenthood, gang violence, and drug abuse. These issues are what's really, as we said before, plaguing the black community, and not racism. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Jocko's plan there, because excuse me, I 100% agree with it. I mean, he explained very clearly, when you're a veteran, you train for 6 or 12 months for a 6-month tour. And then we have these police that are doing tours for their entire lives, and they get like 8 hours of training with actual like grappling techniques and stuff like that. It's just ridiculous. So people should be constantly training that are in the police. I'm really glad you mentioned that. It makes so much sense when you say it. So yeah, I think that's another one of those things that people are just going to absolutely be on board with. And yeah, as you said, like, there's a lot of different things affecting different communities. You can't just look at it nationwide. I mean, yeah, there has been cases where, like, there's hundreds of videos of police brutality. In the instance where that elderly man was pushed down by the police, and then those police were fired, 57 fellow Buffalo police resigned in solidarity over those guys getting suspended. So, I mean, yeah, there's issues with some police for sure, and it might be more than an individual aspect in some circumstances, but it's still not statewide or nationwide. Like, just because Buffalo itself has a problem with their police, which has been rampant for years now, like they've had alcoholism through their police force as well. They've had to try and deal with that. They have no solution to it because obviously alcohol is one of the only legal drugs. So these guys go and get drunk when they're off shift. And what can you do? So, I mean, trying to just paint all police bad just because these 57 guys resigned in solidarity with a bad officer is, again, disingenuous argument. And liberals love to, talk about that stuff. So I think it's more fair to look at it by county to county. That's literally how policing works in our society right now. Like, we don't have many state police and like the federal police are not even interacting with people unless they're serious criminals. So, yeah, I agree with you on pretty much all you said there, though.
Right. And I'm glad we see this on the same page, because right now there's so much division and opinion and and superficial things like race that it's good to end on something that we are all sane people. We can all have a conversation and just agree on something for change.
Exactly. I think, like you said, Yang, it chokes me up too thinking about him because he's got the answer for everything, man. And not just with policing, but as you said, like all these issues that are affecting the black community at large that need to be addressed, like the root, as you said, and as Andrew always says. And what is it really going to help people the most there? UBI. That would help black community and other poor communities the most. So Andrew Yang has not lost his relevance, guys.
And on that note, I think that's all we have time for today. We'll catch you next time with a new episode.
Take it easy, everybody. Thanks.